When I last covered the Carbon Isles mod for Sonic Roll Blast 2, it had already undergone a significant overhaul from its initial release. But even as I was creating my review at the request of the mod's director Sketchzelle, she had already begun work and promotion of a second major overhaul, which he had named Demo 3. Therefore, I knew even at the time that I'd have to revisit these isles. Demo 3 released months ago now, and I'll admit to focusing on other projects over it. I assumed that even with the changes made, the experience would be much the same as it was during my initial review, and my criticisms would still hold water. But I've finally gotten around to looking in on the mod's progress, and I can safely say they don't anymore. Or rather, they now exist in a very different context to before, and need to be recontextualized and rewritten to be considered fair. For as much as many things within the Carbon Isles have changed, just as many have stayed the same. As is often the case for my work, this has been long overdue, but here's your visitor's guide to Carbon Isles Demo 3, where I'll go over everything that's changed within the mod over the last 12 months. Assuming that you activated every file within the unusually expansive folder that contains the Carbon Isles mod, the first thing that you'll recognize is that the custom UI is more or less the same as it was before. Indeed, while levels, cutscenes, characters and more got overhauls and expansions, the UI is unchanged, or at least has changed so little that I don't feel the need to expand my thoughts on it any further than I did in my first review. And while we're on the topic of areas that have seen changes minimal enough that I won't bother talking about them here, the music has also seen few changes. I think every boss and stage that existed in Demo 2 uses the same music as before, despite the differences elsewhere, so all that has changed on that front is the addition of new music for the new Lunar Landslide Zone. I think these tracks are the best yet, but they were composed by the same composer in the same style as every other stage, so if you didn't like the music there, these probably aren't going to be a cause for reassessment. Of course, after navigating through the main menu, the first thing you need to do is pick your character, but I'd like to go into that later, so I'll start by talking about the changes with Carbon Isles' cutscenes. These have made the storyline at play here much easier to understand, as many levels and bosses will start with a cutscene explaining how and why Sonic and Tails are there. Unfortunately, there are no variants for any other characters, which is understandable, but still the same. Cutscenes are rare enough in SRB2, but it's rarer still for them to be voiced like these are. Unfortunately, terrible audio mixing has done a number on the voice acting. It's the only way I can pick up more than a few lines here or there is by wearing headphones.
So, what about the facility and the environment? Why must you pollute the coastline? It's such a beautiful place.
Foxboy, this is not it. Can you read? My architecture doesn't even resemble something like this.
But with the exception of Tails, who is way too deep, the actors seem to have done a pretty good job. The illustrations are also pretty amateur, with nothing ever even being close to staying on model, and proportions varying wildly from shot to shot, but Sketchzelle's work is always like this. The audio mixing is maybe the most immediate and obvious problem, but the biggest improvement that could be made is perhaps also the smallest. Just tell me how to skip these. It was driving me up the wall by the 6th time I had to sit through the same cutscenes, and they last long enough that once you've learned the states that they prelude, you can spend more time watching them than playing the game. I don't need to rewatch them every time I replay a stage or start a save file as a character who doesn't even appear in them, and the game doesn't tell you that they can be skipped by holding spin. I had to ask Sketchzelle directly. Once you get past the opening cutscene, which you may or may not have understood a word of, you'll start your adventure in the same stage as always, Seaside Coast, in a familiar location. Both stages of Seaside Coast use the same base concept in both Demo 2 and Demo 3. And compared to the radically different Soda facility, they do share a lot of similarities to what came before. Platforming has been modified to allow for faster movement, and the stages have increased in length, which remedy my problems with the Demo 2 equivalents. Unfortunately, Soda facility has been ruined in the overhaul, with every interesting idea the earlier version had utterly thrown away and replaced with a massive overuse of jettisons, utter contempt for the player's time with slowly opening doors and sections that drag on far past the point of novelty, as well as poor signposting that leads to the player getting lost constantly, which is the exact opposite signposting problem the Demo 2 version had. But once you make it past that, you'll find your way to the aforementioned new Lunar Landslide Zone, which has some pretty interesting ideas using the level's odd gravity, and has few of the problems plaguing the previous zone. Sadly, it does have some areas that needed to be playtested more extensively due to mistakes made as the level was designed, and it is currently only a single sort act. Therefore, it doesn't do much to fix one of Carbon House's major problems, which is that at just 5 acts that don't offer much in the way of replay value, it's still quite short and clearly unfinished. You'll get through it in about 15 to 20 minutes, and while there are several bonus stages, they won't extend your playtime much or rekindle a desire to keep playing. I've only played Carbon Hours as much as I have to make my notes, test them out as I write my script, and to record my footage. I wouldn't have replayed it over and over and over again, like I do with SRB2 proper, if it wasn't that I needed to. Something I wasn't necessarily expecting from Carbon Hours is a suite of mostly new bosses. I can count on one hand the mods that have made their own bosses over reusing the same Eggmobile or Egg Slimer fights from the vanilla game, and until Demo 3, Carbon Hours was not one of them. There are 4 of these, 3 of which are new, and while not all of them are great, I think the unique ones are highlights of the whole experience. The final fight against Metal Sonic is the worst the mod has to offer, but that's mostly due to the terrible design of the vanilla Metal Sonic fight. He is slightly remixed with new attacks and phases, but that was never going to compensate for his horrible AI, which makes it a game of luck whether you can actually attack him. The Egg Fireball in Noto base also isn't fantastic, but that's due to it being boring, predictable, and completely harmless. It's not an enraging fight like Metal Sonic is, rather one you'll forget immediately after it's over. On the other hand, the first 2 story bosses go head to head with the best that the vanilla game has to offer. That may be a low bar, but still, I think the Egg Decker at the end of Seaside Coast is a smart mashup of the Eggmobile and the Crustacean's Pincer, which I'd argue is a more potent weapon than anything the rest of the bosses have, and it uses it for a variety of interesting attacks. It would honestly be one of the best boss fights in SRB2, if not for the arena, which has terrible visibility due to poor lighting and an overabundance of decorations that cover the camera. Brighten it up and remove most of these trees, and we'd have something great here. The Egg Blender in Soda facility is also pretty good, and the highlight of the stage. It's not as polished a fight as the Egg Decker, you never see something like this added to the vanilla game, but it does something rare for SRB2 by allowing you to create your own attack opportunities outside of the boss's clearly defined patterns. The fight could do with some way of teaching the player what each of these bubbles do, as well as a more interesting second phase, but these 2 fights more than make up for a disappointing bout against Metal Sonic. Before I go on to discussing the final area that Carbon Hours mod I was in though, I should mention the arena, which is one of the major new additions Demo 3 has introduced. It's a boss rush much like any other, albeit done without any rings and only a shield of your choosing to aid you. I only played through it once to see what it was, and only with a character with powerful offensive capabilities, but it seemed like a pretty well made version of the concept. There's some custom music and new arena textures to match the Colosseum theming, as well as crowds there to watch the brawl. I had fun running through it, although I imagined that it would be a lot more painful as characters with less room for error. It's ultimately not required as part of the main storyline though, so while the challenge might be a bit extreme, that's not too much of a problem. My thoughts on the characters in Demo 2 were pretty neutral. Some upgrades here, some downgrades there, a few ugly colour schemes and a few unpolished characters beyond the vanilla roster meant everything that was either good or bad about all of the changes ends up cancelling each other out. I'd say that still applies to Demo 3. Tails, Knuckles, Amy and Fang all feel pretty unchanged, and I've covered Clone Metal Sonic and one of the Sketchzelle inserts in their own reviews, which leaves just Sonic, Metal Sonic, Snonic, and the other Sketchzelle worth talking about. Snonic is a boring gag character whose only notable trait is that all of his flailing sounds like struggling fists, so you aren't missing much if you don't bother playing as him. I remember Metal Sonic feeling pretty handicapped the last time I played Carbon Hours, and while I can't remember exactly why that was to know for certain whether the reason for that has actually been changed, he now feels just as powerful as his vanilla appearance. Sketchzelle PT, on the other hand, was completely unplayable for me. They seem to have a moveset inspired by Pizza Tower, but I had a glitch where they'd constantly stop dead and taunt, which made it impossible to get anywhere with them. I had similar problems with Tails and Fang constantly throwing bombs even after I'd unmapped any button I could find that might trigger that ability, so I imagine it's somehow linked to that. And finally, Sonic, who I found to feel pretty strange in Demo 2, has seen a few buffs. Generally, levels seem better designed for his moveset, so platforming doesn't feel as bad as it did before, even if its double jump is still very inconsistent with how much height it gives you. But in terms of actual moveset changes, he's received a new ability in the form of the Lightspeed Dash, which the level designers have been very eager to provide lots of opportunities for. I understand why, because it is very fun to use and works pretty well. No one has ever cracked the code to make the Lightspeed Dash behave exactly as you'd expect it to, even Sonic Team themselves, but this is on the same level as their attempts, and therefore more than good enough. These are still not a set of moveset changes that I take over what we already have in the vanilla cast, but the most disagreeable parts have been sanded down enough that I'd say they're now at an overall good enough. They weren't really necessary, but now I'm not going to be complaining about how they're stopping me from playing with the vanilla movesets. Overall, Carbon Isles Demo 3 is a significant update over what came before it, and expands the mod in myriad ways. The problem is, I'm not sure it really fixes any of the underlying problems I had with Demo 2. There were 4 main complaints I left that review with: assault length, a bad story, poor signposting, and mediocre characters. The only one that I'd say I really saw a significant improvement in was with the story, and even that fell quite far short of what it could be due to some easy to fix problems. The introduction of one new zone doesn't change the fact that Carbon Hours is short and lacks real replay value. Signposting has gone even worse across the board, and while some characters have seen improvements, it still isn't enough to make them definitive upgrades over their vanilla incarnations, and that's not to mention most of the unique characters fall far below even that. Changes have been made and pieces have been shuffled around, for better or for worse, but it doesn't change the fact that underneath it all, the essential elements that make up Carbon Hours still haven't really improved. My time was enjoyable enough, but I think there's still a lot of untapped potential here. I hope you enjoyed the video, and ciao.